As the winter months wore on, the Vikings' ability to adapt and endure was not only reflected in their physical and mental resilience but also in their capacity to innovate and improve upon existing methods of survival. The long, harsh winters of Scandinavia demanded constant evolution, and the Vikings did not rest on their laurels. They used the cold season as an opportunity to refine their strategies, explore new solutions to age-old problems, and enhance their chances of survival through clever innovation. It was during these long nights and frozen days that they honed the skills, tools, and techniques that allowed them to thrive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. One of the key innovations that became crucial to Viking survival was the development and refinement of their clothing. While the basic structure of Viking clothing had remained fairly consistent, the way in which they adapted it to the extreme cold was a product of years of trial, error, and ingenuity. Clothing was not just a form of protection, it was a complex system designed to trap warmth, wick away moisture, and allow for freedom of movement. Viking tunics and trousers were often made from wool, which, despite its rough texture, was highly effective at insulating and retaining heat even when wet. Animal pelts, such as those from reindeer and wolves, were carefully fashioned into cloaks and coats, providing an extra layer of warmth. However, it was the meticulous process of layering these materials, along with the addition of leather, fur, and other natural substances, that allowed the Vikings to create highly functional, multi-layered garments. Additionally, the Vikings would frequently wear knitted gloves, socks, and hats, all of which were crafted to suit the harsh environment. These knitted garments were particularly important in keeping extremities warm, which was essential in preventing frostbite during extended periods outside. One of the innovations that helped Viking survival was the use of insulating layers made from natural materials such as moss, which could be stuffed between layers of clothing to provide additional warmth. This resourceful use of materials ensured that the Vikings remained as warm as possible, even during the most extreme weather conditions. While clothing was a major focus of innovation, the Vikings also looked to improve their tools and methods for heating their homes. Longhouses, where entire families lived, were designed to withstand the intense cold and provide a sustainable living environment. The Viking longhouses were typically constructed with thick wooden walls, covered with sod or thatch to help insulate them against the biting cold. The roofs were steeply pitched to prevent snow accumulation, which could weigh down the structure and cause collapse. Inside, the hearths were carefully designed to provide maximum warmth. Viking hearths were often centrally located in the middle of the home, ensuring that the heat would disperse throughout the dwelling. In some longhouses, Viking families created a clever system of heated floors using stones and fire. Heated stones would be placed in the fire, and once they had absorbed enough heat, they would be moved into the living spaces. The stones slowly released warmth throughout the night, providing a constant source of heat in the home. This technique, which allowed them to retain warmth even when the fire had burned down to embers, was a vital innovation that helped the Vikings endure the harsh winter months. This was especially important as firewood could be scarce during the winter, so any method that allowed for maximum heat retention was crucial. The Vikings also employed innovative methods for food preservation during the long winter months. Given that hunting and fishing were less productive during the winter, the Vikings turned to preservation techniques to ensure they had enough food to sustain them until the spring thaw. One of the key methods used by the Vikings was drying and smoking meat, fish, and other perishable goods. Meat would be carefully salted or smoked, then stored in cool, dry places. This preserved food could be kept for months, ensuring that the Vikings had access to protein-rich foods when fresh game was unavailable. In addition to smoking and drying, the Vikings were masters of preserving dairy products. Milk, butter, and cheese could be kept for months in the cold conditions, allowing the Vikings to maintain a healthy diet during the winter. The Vikings' ability to preserve their food was not only a matter of practicality but also a reflection of their deep connection to the land. They understood the seasonal cycles and knew that they had to plan ahead to ensure they could survive during the lean months. As the Vikings navigated through the harsh winter months, they also developed advanced techniques for finding food in the snowy wilderness. Their deep knowledge of animal tracks, signs of life, and the land itself allowed them to track and hunt game even in the most inhospitable conditions. Reindeer, elk, wild boar, and other animals were still available to them if they knew where to look and how to track them effectively. Hunting during the winter was a skill that required patience, keen observation, and an intimate understanding of animal behavior. The Vikings were highly skilled hunters, and their ability to adapt their methods to the frozen landscape was a key factor in their survival. For the Vikings, survival during the winter was not just a matter of gathering food, staying warm, and avoiding the dangers of the cold. It was also about maintaining their sense of identity and ensuring the continuity of their culture and community. Throughout the long winter months, they would continue to honor their gods, celebrate important festivals, and keep their spirits high through the sharing of stories, songs, and rituals. These activities were not merely a distraction from the cold but essential components of Viking life. They kept the Vikings connected to their past, to their gods, and to each other. One of the most significant cultural practices was the honoring of the gods during the winter solstice. The solstice marked the turning point of the year, where the days began to lengthen and the sun started its journey back into the sky. The Vikings celebrated this time of renewal and rebirth with feasts, sacrifices, and rituals aimed at ensuring the return of the sun and the blessings of the gods. The sacrifices made during this time were not just for the gods but also for the people. They were offerings made with the hope that the gods would grant the Vikings strength, protection, and guidance in the year to come. The Vikings' reverence for the natural world and their belief in the cycles of life and death were integral to their survival in the winter months. They saw winter not as a time of despair but as a necessary season in the eternal cycle of life. Winter was a time to rest, to reflect, and to prepare for the challenges of the coming year. It was a time to honor the past and look forward to the future with hope and optimism. Through their innovation, resourcefulness, and cultural practices, the Vikings were able to endure the harsh winter months and emerge stronger for the experience. In conclusion, the Viking response to the brutal winter conditions was a multifaceted approach that combined physical, mental, and cultural strategies. Their innovations in clothing, heating, food preservation, and hunting allowed them to not only survive but thrive in one of the most challenging climates on Earth. However, it was their strong sense of identity, their deep connection to their past, and their reliance on community that ultimately allowed them to endure the darkness of winter and emerge stronger in the spring. The Viking way of life was not one of mere survival. It was a way of life that embraced hardship, sought wisdom, and adapted to the changing seasons with resilience and strength. Their ability to innovate, adapt, and remain connected to each other and to the natural world ensured that their legacy would endure long after the last snow had melted. To understand how the Vikings survived, it's essential to first understand the world they inhabited. Imagine the frozen landscapes of Scandinavia, the towering mountain ranges covered in snow, the dark forests where daylight barely touched the ground, and the endless seas stretching far into the horizon. The Vikings didn't simply live in a world of winter, they lived in a world defined by its harshness, where winter was not a fleeting season but a constant battle. It was a land where the grip of cold would freeze your breath midair and bite through the thickest of clothing. But this wasn't the kind of cold that arrived with a predictable chill. No, the Viking winter was brutal, unpredictable, and merciless. The Scandinavian landscape, where these legendary seafarers and warriors were born, was shaped by the Ice Age. Long winters and short summers gave rise to a harsh, unforgiving environment. Snow would begin to fall as early as September and continue until April. It wasn't just the cold that made survival difficult, it was the sheer length of the winter. 4 months on end, the sun would barely rise above the horizon, and when it did, it would be weak and distant, casting only a pale light across the frozen earth. Even the air seemed to freeze, biting and cutting at anyone foolish enough to stay outdoors for too long. Picture yourself in this landscape. The earth is covered in a thick blanket of snow that doesn't simply decorate the ground but turns it into an obstacle. Travel becomes a daunting task as each step sinks into deep drifts. Rivers, lakes, and fjords freeze solid, trapping both animals and humans in a frozen world. The cold would seep into everything: the homes, the clothes, the food, and the very bones of the people who lived here. The cold didn't just affect how the Vikings dressed or where they built their homes. It became an integral part of their survival, an ever-present challenge they had to meet every single day. Now, Imagine the Vikings, with their ships still tucked away in their harbors and their weapons stored for the next season of raids, having to survive this unrelenting winter. They didn't have the luxury of turning on the heat when the chill became unbearable, nor did they have modern insulation to trap the warmth. The houses they built, though sturdy and practical, were far from impervious to the cold. Roofs sagged under heavy snow, walls were made of wood and turf, materials that were far better at keeping out the rain than the biting cold. The hearth inside the longhouses, the center of Viking life, would burn low in the winter, often unable to fight the constant invasion of frost. Even the toughest warriors, accustomed to the fierce heat of battle and the bracing sea winds, would find themselves vulnerable to the relentless chill of winter. This was no ordinary cold. The cold of Viking winters was the kind of cold that creeps into your skin and stays there, gnawing at you relentlessly. The kind that numbs your fingers and toes, that steals away warmth in the blink of an eye. It is the cold that makes you think twice before stepping outside, before leaving the protection of your home, and before exposing yourself to nature's unforgiving wrath. The Vikings understood this cold. They knew it like an old adversary, one they had to outwit, endure, and, most importantly, respect. But perhaps what makes Viking winters even more formidable was the sheer isolation of the Viking world. While the villages were relatively close-knit, the land was vast and sparsely populated. This meant that the Vikings could not rely on neighbors or distant kin when the cold set in. If a storm struck or the weather turned particularly cruel, they were on their own. For a people whose survival depended on cooperation, this posed a constant challenge. In the winter, there was no room for the individualistic warrior spirit that fueled their raids. Instead, survival required collaboration and cleverness, an understanding that the cold would not discriminate. It would threaten everyone equally, whether they were a farmer, a hunter, or a sailor. The days were short, and the nights stretched on endlessly. Darkness seemed to swallow up the world. Without the warmth of sunlight, the body became disoriented. People were forced into long hours of rest and sleep, sometimes too long. The prolonged darkness had a way of distorting the sense of time. The lack of sunlight caused discomfort, affecting both the mind and the body. The weight of winter's darkness hung heavy on the soul. Yet it was this very darkness, this silence, that spurred the Viking resilience, forcing them to adapt, innovate, and bond in ways that are difficult to comprehend in today's world. The sea, which had brought them fortune in the form of raids and trade, now posed another challenge. For those who lived along the coast, the bitter cold of the winter months brought freezing waters and stormy seas. Their famed longships, built for agility on the waves, were often rendered useless in the ice. Even the mighty ships could not defy the cold. When they could not sail or raid, the Vikings were forced to focus on surviving in place, drawing upon whatever resources they had left: tools, clothing, food, and the warmth of their companions. Inland, the situation was no less dire. The forests of Scandinavia, though thick and rich in wildlife, became hostile to human presence during the winter. While these forests offered food and materials during the warmer months, they turned into a maze of icy trails and dangerous, frozen rivers in the winter. Wild game, once plentiful, became harder to find as animals hibernated or sought refuge in places inaccessible to humans. Hunting in the winter was a laborious, often fruitless effort, leaving the Vikings with little more than what they had stored or foraged before the first snow. Yet amidst this desolate landscape, life continued. There were no miracles, no sudden surges of heat or spring-like relief. The Vikings knew that surviving winter was about maintaining balance and being prepared. They had to plan ahead. They knew the value of patience. Every decision mattered, from when to harvest and store food, to when to gather wood, to when to retreat into the shelter of their homes. There was a rhythm to their survival, a quiet intelligence that worked with nature rather than against it. And this intelligence was not the product of a single mind or a few clever inventions. It was the collective wisdom of centuries, passed down from generation to generation. It was the wisdom of people who had learned to read the land, to read the sky, to read the weather. They had learned to listen, to observe, and most importantly, to endure. In the end, the Viking winter was not a challenge they could defeat. It was a challenge they had to live with, navigate, respect, and work within. And as the long months of winter came and went, the Vikings learned that survival was not just about battling the cold. It was about learning to live alongside it. It was about finding warmth not just in fire, but in resourcefulness, in innovation, and in the strength of community. They understood that winter was not an enemy to be conquered, but a force to be reckoned with, just as much a part of their world as the sea, the sky, and the people they loved. In the frozen world of the Vikings, survival was not merely about enduring the cold, it was about outwitting it. The Vikings were not just warriors and traders, they were masterful innovators, creators of solutions that often bordered on genius. They were people who could adapt, shift, and thrive in a world where resources were sparse and the weather was an unyielding adversary. But their ingenuity in staying warm, especially during the long, harsh winters, is perhaps one of the most underestimated aspects of their survival. In a time when the simplest of comforts was a luxury, the Vikings knew how to turn the most basic of materials into life-saving innovations. The Viking spirit of ingenuity was born out of necessity. They did not have the luxury of modern technology or the wealth to import goods from warmer climates. What they had was a deep understanding of their environment and a relentless drive to make the most of it. They knew that if they were to survive, they had to find ways to make the cold an ally, rather than an enemy. The Viking approach to warmth was not about excess or extravagance, but about efficiency, resourcefulness, and a quiet, ever-present understanding of the land. They did not waste energy, nor did they look for shortcuts. They simply worked with what they had, and what they had was nature itself. One of the most striking aspects of Viking ingenuity was their use of natural materials for warmth. While wool and fur are often associated with warmth today, for the Vikings, these were more than just clothes, they were essential tools for survival. Viking clothing was a marvel of efficiency. The layers they wore were designed not just for comfort, but for practicality. Wool, in particular, was one of the most valued resources in Viking society, and for good reason. It was a material that could trap heat even when wet, offering a level of warmth and insulation that few other fabrics could provide. This made it the ideal choice for long winters when the Vikings would spend days in the cold, hunting, fishing, or traveling. But it wasn't just the clothing that mattered, it was how the Vikings used the materials they had to create environments that could hold and preserve heat. When the Vikings built their homes, they didn't just think about shelter, they thought about how to keep that shelter warm. The longhouse, which was the quintessential Viking home, was a masterpiece of architectural ingenuity. The longhouse was built with a focus on warmth, with walls that were thick and insulated using turf and wood, materials that offered both protection from the elements and the ability to trap heat. Inside, the longhouse was designed for efficiency. The hearth, often located in the center of the room, was the heart of the home, providing warmth and light for the entire family. The smoke from the fire would rise through a central chimney or hole in the roof, but the heat would remain within the walls, warming everyone gathered around it. But warmth wasn't just about staying inside, it was also about staying close. Vikings knew that in the bitter cold of winter, the best way to preserve heat was by sharing it. The design of their homes reflected this communal spirit. Longhouses were built to accommodate large families, and sometimes entire communities, all living under one roof. The warmth of one person would be shared with the next. The heat from their bodies, the warmth from the fire, and the closeness of their relationships helped to create an environment where survival was possible. There was a quiet wisdom in this. In a world where the cold was a constant threat, Vikings learned that warmth wasn't just about materials, it was about people. The ingenuity of the Vikings extended to their clothing, homes, and tools. One of their most fascinating innovations was their use of animal pelts and skins. The Vikings were expert hunters and trappers, and they knew how to use every part of the animals they killed. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of this was the way they treated the fur and hide. Rather than simply using these materials for decoration or utility, they learned to prepare them in a way that would maximize their insulating properties. Animal furs, particularly those from bears, reindeer, and seals, were carefully tanned and preserved to create cloaks, gloves, and boots that could trap warmth and provide a layer of protection against the elements. These garments were not just stylish or functional, They were essential to survival in a world where temperatures regularly dropped below freezing. In addition to fur, the Vikings also used other natural materials to create warmth. The Vikings were skilled weavers and craftsmen, and they created intricate textiles that were both beautiful and practical. The Viking cloak, known as a kilt, or mantle, was often woven from wool and decorated with patterns that reflected both cultural and functional elements. These garments were not just for protection against the cold, they were often used as a symbol of status and identity. Wool was not only durable but also an excellent insulator, and the weaving process allowed for designs that could trap and preserve heat in a way that few other fabrics could. It wasn't just about warmth, it was about blending function with culture, creating garments that reflected the Vikings' deep connection to both their environment and their heritage. But Viking ingenuity didn't stop with clothing and homes. It extended to the very way they approached warmth in all aspects of life. When traveling by sea, for example, Vikings would use clever techniques to keep warm despite the harsh winds and frigid temperatures. Their ships, built for agility and speed, were designed to allow the crew to travel efficiently even during the coldest months of the year. The longship, with its sleek, narrow body, could glide through icy waters with minimal resistance. The Vikings used thick woolen cloaks and layered furs to protect themselves from the elements, and they would bundle up together in small, insulated quarters below deck to share warmth. There was no room for individualism in the Viking way of life. In order to survive, the Vikings had to learn to rely on one another. They shared warmth, resources, and knowledge. In many ways, the Vikings' survival was less about individual brilliance and more about communal ingenuity. It was about using what they had at their disposal, working with the land, and adapting to the challenges that nature presented. The cold was not something to be defeated, it was something to be understood, respected, and lived with. By weaving together their knowledge of materials, architecture, and community, the Vikings were able to create an environment in which warmth could be sustained even in the harshest of conditions. This ingenuity wasn't just a response to the immediate threat of cold. It was a mindset. It was about learning to make do with what was available, about seeing potential in even the most unlikely resources. And in the frozen, desolate world of the Vikings, their ability to adapt and innovate was what allowed them to not only survive, but to flourish. The search for warmth was not just a practical necessity, it was a way of life, woven into every aspect of Viking existence, from their homes to their clothing to the very way they lived and worked together. Through their ingenuity, the Vikings turned the cold into something they could endure, something they could conquer, not with force or fire, but with quiet, lasting intelligence. As the Viking people struggled against the bitter cold of their frozen world, they discovered that fire, although essential for survival, was not always the best answer. At times, it was simply not possible to create or maintain a fire, particularly during long journeys, storms, or in areas where wood was scarce. For the Vikings, the need to stay warm without relying solely on fire became an imperative. This was not merely a matter of convenience but a question of survival. How could they keep warm without the luxury of a roaring hearth at their disposal? It was here that their legendary ingenuity emerged in full force, giving birth to an innovative solution that would define Viking winter survival. A clever trick that involved more than just keeping the cold at bay. It was about making the cold work in their favor. The Vikings, ever resourceful, turned their attention to the properties of the materials they had at hand. They knew that warmth could be conserved, even without fire. The trick lay in trapping heat within layers. Layers of clothing, layers of bedding, and layers of shelter. But the key was not just in piling more materials on top of each other. No, the Viking solution was far more sophisticated. They had discovered the profound insulating properties of animal furs, wool, and skins. With an understanding passed down over generations, they had learned how to create a near-perfect barrier against the cold by wrapping themselves in the right combination of layers. It wasn't just the warmth of each material, it was the way these materials worked together to trap body heat and hold it close, preventing the cold from ever truly penetrating. The first layer of warmth was clothing itself. Viking clothing was not just functional, it was meticulously designed to protect the body from the relentless cold. Wool was the cornerstone of Viking clothing. It wasn't just used because it was abundant, It was used because of its remarkable ability to retain heat, even in damp conditions. Wool, when woven tightly and layered properly, trapped warm air against the skin, acting as an insulating barrier. Beneath this woolen outer layer, Vikings would wear leather or fur-lined garments, further enhancing their protection against the cold. But the key to their success lay in the use of animal pelts, particularly those from animals that thrived in the cold. Reindeer, bears, seals, and even wolves, these furs were not simply decorations but lifelines. The thick undercoats of these animals provided an insulating layer that trapped heat, keeping the Vikings warm even in the most extreme cold. However, the trick didn't stop with the clothing they wore. Vikings understood that layering was the key. They knew that when it came to staying warm, it wasn't enough to just wear a coat or a cloak. Every inch of their bodies needed to be protected, from head to toe. Vikings would often wear several layers of clothing, each one working in tandem to keep the heat close to their bodies. Woolen tunics, lined with furs, would be worn over leather leggings, which were themselves covered by thick, fur-lined boots. The furs they used were not only practical but tailored to preserve warmth and block out the wind. Gloves and hats, often made of reindeer or seal fur, completed the ensemble. Each layer worked together, trapping heat between them and creating a bubble of warmth that could survive even the most frigid nights. Yet, clothing alone could not account for the survival of the Vikings in such harsh conditions. When the Vikings needed to sleep, travel, or endure long nights, they relied on their shelters to preserve the warmth that their clothing had worked so hard to maintain. Viking homes, though simple by today's standards, were ingeniously constructed to offer protection against the elements. The longhouse, with its thick walls made of wood and turf, was designed not just to provide shelter but to capture warmth. The building materials themselves, turf, clay, and wood, acted as insulators, trapping the warmth from the fire and preventing the cold from seeping inside. The structure of the longhouse allowed the heat to radiate outward, while the thick roof and walls trapped it within. Inside, the layout was just as important. The hearth, placed centrally in the longhouse, provided the primary source of warmth. But the warmth didn't simply rise from the hearth and escape, it was carefully managed. The central design allowed the heat to spread throughout the building, warming the inhabitants as they slept or worked. The walls of the longhouse were thick and layered with turf, providing an additional layer of insulation. The roofs, built to withstand heavy snowfall, were often designed with an overhang to allow snow to accumulate on top, creating an additional thermal barrier. The cleverness of the Viking longhouse lay in its ability to keep the cold outside while preserving the warmth from within. But there was more to Viking warmth than just clothing and shelter. The key to their clever trick was how they used their own bodies to generate and preserve heat. Vikings understood that their own warmth could be shared and circulated within a small space. This is where the communal aspect of Viking life came into play. The longhouse was designed not just for shelter but for togetherness. The close quarters meant that the warmth of one person could transfer to another. Families huddled together, sharing warmth, breathing the same air, and living in tight-knit spaces where every bit of heat counted. It was a collective survival tactic. The more bodies there were in one place, the more warmth could be generated and preserved. The Viking longhouse became not just a home, but a sanctuary where people could survive the night without relying on fire alone. When traveling or enduring the outdoors, the Vikings also had clever tricks for staying warm without fire. They would use their ships, which were designed to be both lightweight and fast, to traverse even icy waters. The ship's narrow hull minimized the amount of cold air it encountered, while its sleek design allowed it to glide swiftly over freezing waters. On board, the Vikings would use the same principles of layering and insulation they relied upon at home. Cloaks, furs, and leather garments kept the crew warm even in the coldest conditions. The ship itself, though exposed to the elements, was designed to protect its occupants from the worst of the weather. And when the crew was forced to disembark and camp on land, they would use what they could find, branches, furs, and other natural materials, to build shelters that would keep the cold at bay. The ingenuity was not just in the materials themselves, but in how they were combined and applied to ensure survival. Perhaps the most surprising element of this trick was that it didn't rely on any single innovation or piece of technology. It wasn't a grand invention that saved the Vikings from the cold. It was an understanding of the natural world and a reliance on simple, practical solutions. The Vikings' clever trick was about layering materials, sharing warmth, and using what they had in the most efficient way possible. They didn't wait for warmth to come to them, they created it themselves. They learned how to make the cold their ally, using nature's own insulating materials to trap warmth and preserve it, even in the harshest conditions. This simple, yet profound solution is what allowed the Vikings to endure the relentless cold of their world. They didn't rely solely on fire, they didn't need to. They had something far more valuable: a deep understanding of their environment and a profound connection to the materials that surrounded them. Through their ingenuity, the Vikings discovered that warmth was not something to be created, it was something to be preserved. They had learned the most valuable trick of all: how to hold on to warmth in a world that was intent on taking it away. In the frozen world of the Vikings, where survival depended on making the most of every resource, wool and fur were not merely materials, they were lifelines. To the modern mind, these might seem like commonplace textiles, perhaps best suited for coats and blankets, but to the Vikings, wool and fur were nothing short of miraculous. They were the very fabric of survival, woven into every aspect of their lives. These materials were far more than simple clothing. They were tools, vital, practical, and vital to the Vikings' ability to endure harsh winters. Without the natural insulating power of wool and fur, the Vikings' ability to survive the relentless cold of their world would have been deeply compromised. At the heart of Viking winter survival was the remarkable wool of sheep. The Vikings didn't just wear wool, they understood it. They knew that not all wool was created equal, and that the best wool came from the sheep that lived in the coldest regions of Scandinavia. These hardy animals grew thick, coarse coats that could withstand the most bitter winters. But it wasn't just the density of the wool that made it valuable, it was the structure of the fibers themselves. Wool has a unique ability to trap air, which acts as an insulator, keeping warmth close to the body. The Vikings knew how to weave these fibers into dense, tightly woven fabrics that could hold in heat, even when the wool became damp from snow or sweat. The process of weaving wool into fabric was an art form in itself, passed down from generation to generation. The Vikings used a technique that created garments not just for function, but for longevity. Woolen tunics, cloaks, and socks were standard wear, and each was designed with practical considerations in mind. These garments didn't just shield the wearer from the cold, they actively worked to regulate body temperature. The Vikings understood that warmth wasn't just about protection from the external cold, it was about balancing internal heat. Wool, with its natural breathability, allowed moisture to escape while trapping heat. When layered, wool could create a microclimate around the body, helping to maintain warmth even during prolonged exposure to frigid air. But the Vikings' skill in using wool extended beyond mere clothing. Wool was a cornerstone of Viking architecture as well. In their longhouses, the thick, insulating wool was often used in the construction of bedding and blankets. These items weren't just decorative or for comfort, they were essential for warmth during the long, cold nights. In a time when beds were often little more than furs piled on the floor, a well-constructed woolen blanket could mean the difference between life and death. And because wool retains its insulating properties even when wet, the Vikings could use it in all conditions, whether trekking across snowy landscapes, camping by the sea, or curled up beside a fire in their longhouse. Yet it was not just wool that the Vikings relied on. The other material that played a critical role in their survival was fur, particularly the fur of animals that thrived in the cold. The Vikings were expert hunters and trappers, and they knew exactly which animals would provide the most protection against the biting winds of winter. Furs from reindeer, seals, and bears were highly prized, not only for their warmth but also for their durability. The thick pelts of these animals were not simply worn as coats or cloaks, they were used in a multitude of ways, from boots and gloves to hats and bedding. Fur, like wool, had the ability to trap air, and the longer the fibers, the more heat they could retain. This made it one of the most effective forms of insulation available. In many ways, the use of fur went beyond the functional. The Viking connection to the animals they hunted was deep, and fur was not simply a material, it was a symbol of survival. The The furs of certain animals were thought to impart strength and endurance to the wearer. A warrior might wear the pelt of a bear not only for warmth but to absorb the animal's power and protection. This spiritual aspect of fur use underscored the Vikings' connection to nature, highlighting how their survival strategies were often intertwined with their belief systems. The Vikings used fur not just for clothing but for practical purposes in the construction of their homes. Fur was often used as padding or insulation within the walls of the longhouse, especially in areas where temperatures could drop to dangerous lows. This was yet another clever way the Vikings maximized the utility of the resources available to them. They didn't just wear furs, they incorporated them into the very fabric of their homes, creating spaces that were as warm as possible without the need for constant fire. One of the most ingenious aspects of Viking use of wool and fur was their ability to combine these materials in ways that maximized their respective strengths. Viking cloaks, for example, were often lined with fur, adding a layer of insulation that complemented the woolen outer fabric. Fur-lined boots were designed to protect the feet from the cold, and fur gloves shielded the hands from frostbite. Woolen hats with fur trimmings kept the head warm while still allowing the body to breathe. This blending of materials was a direct response to the ever-present cold, and the Vikings' ability to create layered, functional garments allowed them to withstand the harshest of winters. Moreover, the Vikings didn't just rely on one type of fur or wool. They were adept at choosing the right material for the right conditions. For example, the wool from the Icelandic sheep, which thrived in the harsh winds of the north, was highly valued for its ability to trap heat and wick moisture away from the skin. The fur from animals like reindeer, which lived in the coldest regions of Scandinavia, was perfect for outer layers that needed to block wind and snow. Seals, which lived along the coasts and were well suited to the icy waters of the North Atlantic, provided a softer, more flexible fur that could be used for undergarments or accessories. The Vikings knew exactly what each type of material could offer, and they tailored their clothing to the specific demands of the environment. For all the practical advantages of wool and fur, they were also highly valued in Viking society. These materials were not just necessities, they were symbols of wealth, status, and trade. Wool was often a highly sought-after commodity, and the Vikings traded woolen goods with neighboring cultures and distant lands. Furs, too, were highly prized and could fetch a high price. A finely crafted woolen tunic or a cloak made of bear fur could mark someone as wealthy and important within Viking society. But beyond their value in trade or as luxury items, wool and fur were also symbols of the Viking way of life. They represented resilience, resourcefulness, and a deep connection to the land and its creatures. The value of wool and fur in Viking society wasn't just practical, it was also spiritual. In many Viking myths, animals like bears, wolves, and reindeer were seen as creatures of power, embodying traits like strength, endurance, and agility. To wear the fur of such animals was not just a matter of survival, it was a way of connecting to the deeper forces of nature. It was an acknowledgement of the Vikings' belief that the natural world was a source of strength and wisdom, and that by working in harmony with it, they could not only survive but thrive. In the end, wool and fur were not just materials to the Vikings. They were a testament to the ingenuity, adaptability, and resourcefulness that defined the Viking way of life. These materials, seemingly simple to us today, were the key to survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They were the tools that allowed the Vikings to face the brutal cold of their world with confidence, knowing that with wool, fur, and a deep understanding of nature, they could endure anything the winter threw at them. Through these humble yet powerful materials, the Vikings were able to turn the cold into something they could conquer, not through force or fire, but through careful, intelligent design and an intimate connection to the world around them. In the Viking world, survival was an art, and the Viking longhouse was the canvas upon which this art was painted. The longhouse was not merely a building, it was the heart of Viking life, a space where families, communities, and even entire clans could endure the harsh winters together. It was in the shelter of these longhouses that the Vikings found a sanctuary from the merciless cold that defined their environment. But the longhouse was not just a refuge from the elements. It was a masterwork of design and ingenuity, a clever adaptation to the frozen world outside. Through the Viking longhouse, we can understand how shelter itself became one of the most crucial elements of Viking survival, particularly during the brutal winters when the cold could kill as quickly as hunger or disease. The longhouse, typically ranging from 30 to 60 feet in length, was a versatile structure that provided warmth, security, and social cohesion. Built with simple but effective materials, wood, turf, and sometimes stone, the longhouse was a practical response to the harsh conditions of Scandinavia. Unlike the modern, insulated homes of today, which use sophisticated technology to regulate temperature, the Viking longhouse relied on basic principles of construction and design that were well suited to the cold. The walls were typically made of timber, reinforced with layers of turf, which provided excellent insulation against the biting cold. The roof, thatched with straw or covered with turf, was designed to allow snow to accumulate and further insulate the structure. This use of natural, locally available materials was a hallmark of Viking ingenuity. The longhouse's design ensured that warmth was contained inside, while the outside elements were kept at bay. The most important feature of the longhouse was the hearth, positioned centrally within the building. This hearth, often the only source of fire in the home, was the focal point of the Viking longhouse. Not only did it provide light, but it also generated the heat needed to keep the occupants warm during the long, dark winter nights. The hearth was built into the floor, and its fire was kept low and steady, a steady companion in the cold. Smoke would rise through a hole in the roof or a chimney, allowing the smoke to escape without overwhelming the air inside. The fire's warmth would spread throughout the room, providing heat for the people who gathered around it. But while the hearth was crucial for warmth, it was not always enough to fend off the cold on its own, especially during the most brutal winter nights. That's where the other features of the longhouse came into play. The walls of the longhouse were built to trap the warmth generated by the fire. The thick timber walls, combined with the turf insulation, helped prevent the cold air from seeping inside. It was a design that was remarkably effective, especially in areas where timber was abundant and the harsh winter winds could howl through the open landscape. The roof of the longhouse, with its unique design, was also essential for maintaining warmth. By allowing snow to accumulate on top, the roof acted as a second layer of insulation. The snow would form a protective barrier, keeping the heat from escaping through the roof. This simple but effective method of trapping heat was something the Vikings understood well. They did not have modern materials or high-tech insulation, but they had something even more valuable: an intimate understanding of their environment and how to work with it. Inside the longhouse, the layout was designed to maximize warmth and minimize exposure to the cold. The floor was typically covered with straw or animal hides, which helped to insulate the space from the frozen earth below. The people who lived in the longhouse would sleep on raised platforms made of wood, sometimes covered with furs and blankets. These platforms were positioned near the hearth, so the warmth from the fire could reach them while they slept. Families and even extended families would live together in close quarters, not only for social reasons but for practical ones. The more people who gathered in one space, the more body heat was generated, and the warmer the house became. It was a communal experience, a shared warmth that helped keep the cold at bay. The social aspect of the longhouse was also crucial to survival during the winter months. In a world where the cold was a constant threat, the Vikings knew that their survival depended not just on their ability to stay warm, but on their ability to stay together. The longhouse was more than just a physical shelter, it was a center of community life. It was a place where people gathered not just to sleep but to eat, tell stories, and bond. The communal nature of the longhouse allowed for cooperation in ways that would have been impossible in more isolated dwellings. The warmth generated by the fire and shared by the people inside created a sense of unity and togetherness that was as crucial to survival as the physical warmth itself. However, the longhouse was not just about warmth, it was also about safety. The cold may have been the most pressing concern during the winter, but the Vikings knew that their survival also depended on protection from the dangers that lurked outside. The thick walls and sturdy construction of the longhouse provided a level of security from the wild animals that roamed the forests and the marauding bands that could attack at any time. The longhouse was a fortress, not in the traditional sense of towering stone walls, but in the way it provided refuge and security from the outside world. In the bitter cold of winter, the longhouse was a sanctuary, where the Viking family could feel safe, warm, and united. But while the longhouse was crucial for warmth and protection, it was not a one-size-fits-all solution. The Vikings were a seafaring people, and their travels often took them far from home, to places where they had to rely on more portable forms of shelter. When on the move, Vikings would use tents or shelters made of animal hides, stretched over wooden frames, to provide temporary protection from the elements. These tents, while not as sturdy or permanent as the longhouse, were still designed with warmth in mind. Animal skins, particularly those of reindeer and seals, were used to line the tents, providing an additional layer of insulation. The Vikings knew that even when they couldn't build a permanent shelter, they could still use their knowledge of materials to create a space that would keep them warm in the face of the cold. Despite their expertise in building and designing shelters, the Vikings also understood that shelter alone would not ensure survival. It was not just about how you constructed your home, it was about how you used the shelter. In the Viking world, survival depended on foresight and preparation. The Vikings were keen observers of the seasons, and they knew that the winter months would require careful planning. They would stockpile firewood, food, and other essentials long before the snow arrived. The longhouse was never just a passive space, it was an active part of the survival strategy, a place where everything from the position of the hearth to the construction of the walls was carefully considered to maximize warmth, security, and functionality. The relationship between the Vikings and their shelters was one of mutual respect and understanding. The longhouse was not just a physical structure, it was a living, breathing entity, shaped by the needs of its inhabitants and the demands of the environment. The Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they adapted to it, working with it, and using every tool and resource at their disposal to create warmth. The longhouse was not only a shelter from the cold but a symbol of Viking resilience, ingenuity, and the deep connection between the people and the land they inhabited. In the end, the Viking longhouse was more than just a place to stay. It was a testament to the survival of the Viking people, a reflection of their ability to adapt, innovate, and thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It was a home that provided warmth, security, and community, all while offering a sanctuary from the cold that would otherwise have claimed them. Through the longhouse, the Vikings found a way to live and flourish, even in the darkest, coldest months of the year. And in doing so, they proved that shelter was not just a roof over their heads, it was a critical part of the warmth, security, and survival that made their civilization endure. In the unforgiving world of the Vikings, where the cold gripped every corner of their land and winter could stretch on for months, survival wasn't just about staying warm on the outside, it was equally about keeping the warmth within. The Vikings, known for their seafaring prowess and raiding adventures, had to develop methods of food preservation that ensured they had enough to eat through the harsh winter months. These methods were as critical to their survival as the clothing they wore or the shelter they built. Food was not just sustenance, it was a vital resource that helped the Vikings endure, offering them the energy they needed to fight the cold, stay healthy, and survive. The concept of food preservation was central to Viking life, and it was through their mastery of preserving food that they managed to thrive in an environment that could be so brutally harsh. In the winter, the ground froze and hunting and farming became difficult, if not impossible. Therefore, the Vikings had to rely on food they had stored from the more temperate seasons. These preserved foods were designed not just to feed the Vikings in their time of need, but to sustain them through the long, frozen nights, when hunting and gathering were not viable options. It was through this careful preparation and the preservation of their resources that they could keep the warmth within, literally and figuratively. One of the most effective ways the Vikings preserved food was through salting. Salting was a process that drew moisture out of the food, which helped prevent spoilage. For the Vikings, salting was especially critical when it came to preserving fish and meat. As a seafaring people, they had an abundance of fish, particularly herring, cod, and other local varieties. These fish were salted and packed into barrels, where they could be stored for months, even through the harshest winters. The salt worked as both a preservative and a flavor enhancer, ensuring that the Vikings had access to protein-rich foods even when the world outside was frozen solid. Salted fish was often a staple of their diet during the long months of winter, providing a crucial source of sustenance when fresh food was scarce. Meat preservation was just as important as fish preservation, particularly when it came to larger game animals like boar, reindeer, and cattle. The Vikings were skilled hunters, and they knew how to make use of every part of the animals they hunted. After a successful hunt, the meat would be salted, smoked, or dried to ensure that it would last through the winter. Smoking meat was another popular method of preservation. The process of smoking not only helped keep the meat edible for long periods but also added a unique flavor that would be savored during the long winter months. In some cases, Vikings would hang the meat in the rafters of their longhouses, where the smoke from the hearth would provide a constant, gentle drying process. This was another example of Viking ingenuity, using the elements of nature, such as fire and smoke, to preserve their food and ensure it would sustain them when the cold made hunting and foraging impossible. Drying fruits and vegetables was another common practice among the Vikings, particularly for those living in the more inland regions, where agriculture was an essential part of life. During the summer months, when the land was fertile and abundant, the Vikings would harvest crops like barley, oats, and root vegetables. These were then dried, either by hanging them in the sun or storing them in cool, dry places, where they would remain preserved throughout the winter. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips were especially important, as they could be stored in the cool earth or in cellars to maintain their freshness. Grains were typically stored in granaries or silos, protected from rodents and moisture, ensuring they would be available when the cold months set in. But the Vikings' mastery of food preservation didn't stop with salting, smoking, and drying. They were also skilled in fermentation, a process that would not only preserve food but also enhance its nutritional value. One of the most common fermented foods in Viking society was dairy, particularly in the form of butter, cheese, and sour cream. The Vikings understood the process of fermentation and used it to turn milk into food that could last for months, even in the absence of refrigeration. In fact, dairy products were a key part of the Viking diet, providing them with essential fats and proteins during the long winter months. By fermenting milk into butter and cheese, the Vikings could create a source of fat and protein that didn't require constant refrigeration, making it ideal for storage during the cold season. Another example of Viking ingenuity in food preservation was their use of honey. Honey, often harvested from wild bees, was prized for its sweetness, but more importantly, for its preservative qualities. It could be used to preserve fruits, nuts, and even meats. The Vikings used honey in a variety of ways, from making mead to sweetening their food and beverages. Honey's ability to prevent spoilage made it an essential part of their food storage, providing a reliable source of sweetness and sustenance throughout the year. The practice of preserving food with honey may seem simple, but it reflects the Vikings' deep understanding of nature and their ability to make the most of the resources available to them. Despite the advanced methods of food preservation they employed, the Vikings were not immune to the risks of food scarcity during the winter months. The cold could spoil even the most carefully preserved food, especially if the cold caused the storage conditions to become less than ideal. For this reason, the Vikings would carefully monitor their food stores throughout the winter, ensuring that their reserves remained in good condition. In some cases, if food stores began to run low, they would rely on stored grains and preserved meats to carry them through the lean months. The Vikings' deep knowledge of food preservation allowed them to maximize their stores, preventing waste and ensuring that they would not be left without vital sustenance when they needed it most. The role of food preservation in Viking life was not just about physical survival, it was also about maintaining the warmth within. The energy provided by preserved food helped the Vikings keep their bodies strong and resilient in the face of the cold. The warmth generated from within, through the consumption of these hardy, preserved foods, became as important as the warmth generated by fire. This connection between food and warmth was deeply embedded in Viking culture, where the rituals surrounding meals and feasts were as important as the meals themselves. A communal feast around the hearth was not just a way to fill one's stomach, it was a reaffirmation of Viking strength, resilience, and unity. The methods of food preservation the Vikings employed reflect a deep connection between their daily lives and the environment in which they lived. They didn't just survive the cold, they learned how to live with it, adapting every aspect of their existence to the challenges the winter posed. Food preservation in all its forms played a vital role in this process, providing not just sustenance but the energy and warmth the Vikings needed to continue their way of life, even as the world outside turned icy and inhospitable. Ultimately, the Vikings' approach to food preservation was a testament to their ability to turn scarcity into abundance. They didn't rely on modern conveniences or imported goods. They relied on what nature provided, using their knowledge of the land and the resources it offered to preserve food in ways that ensured they would not only survive but thrive in the harshest of winters. Through their skill in food preservation, the Vikings were able to hold onto warmth not just physically, but in the spirit of resilience and adaptation that defined their culture. When one thinks of the Vikings, images of fierce warriors, long ships cutting through the cold waters of the North Sea, and rugged landscapes often come to mind. But beyond their famous raids and seafaring adventures, the Vikings were a deeply communal society where survival in the cold, harsh winters was not an individual task, it was a shared responsibility. The Viking social structure played a vital role in the ability of these people to endure the bitter winters that defined much of their existence. As much as the cold was an enemy to be fought with fire, wool, and ingenuity, it was also a force that required unity and cooperation. The social dynamics within Viking society, particularly during the long, isolating winters, were built upon values of collaboration, mutual support, and community strength. Viking society was structured around families, clans, and tribes, each of which played a specific role in ensuring the survival of the whole. At the heart of this structure was the horger, the extended family or household, where multiple generations lived under one roof, often within the same longhouse. These communal spaces were not just for living, they were a reflection of Viking values and the way they understood warmth, protection, and care. The longhouse, with its shared warmth, provided more than shelter, it was a symbol of unity. The family and community members who lived together in this space relied on each other to survive the winter, pooling resources, sharing warmth, and offering support in times of need. Within the Viking household, the roles were well defined but not rigid. The elderly, women, and children all had important roles to play in maintaining the warmth and safety of the family unit. Women were primarily responsible for the daily household tasks, including cooking, weaving, and caring for the children. In a society where food preservation was essential, the women were the stewards of the family's stored provisions. They would manage the salted meats, dried fish, and preserved vegetables, ensuring that the family had enough food to last through the winter. The act of preparing meals was not just about nourishment, it was a ritual that brought the family together around the hearth, reinforcing the sense of warmth and community. As the hearth fire burned low, the family would sit around it, eating and telling stories, passing down knowledge from one generation to the next. This communal ritual was central to maintaining morale and unity during the long, isolated winter months. The elderly in Viking society were respected for their wisdom and experience, and they had an important role in the social fabric of the community. They were often the keepers of oral history, sharing stories of past victories, tales of the gods, and lessons about survival. In a time when literacy was rare, the elderly passed down cultural traditions, survival skills, and family histories through spoken word. Their stories not only kept the fire of Viking culture alive but also reinforced the collective identity of the group. These elders were the wise voices in the longhouse, helping younger generations navigate the challenges of survival, including the psychological toll that long winters could take. Their wisdom offered comfort and guidance, ensuring that no one would face the darkness of winter alone. The bond between family members was vital in maintaining warmth, both physical and emotional, through the winter months. The cold, while a physical challenge, also presented psychological obstacles. The isolation of the winter months could lead to feelings of loneliness, depression, or hopelessness. But in the Viking community, there was little room for such isolation. The strong ties between family members created a network of emotional and practical support. If one member of the family was ill, the others would rally to care for them, sharing their warmth, food, and resources. If someone fell on hard times, the clan would provide what was needed to see them through. This communal care was essential to the survival of Viking society, especially during the harshest months of winter, when the isolation of the cold could feel overwhelming. The Viking clan system extended beyond the family and was crucial in ensuring the survival of the wider community. While a household might consist of a few families living together under one roof, the larger clan often included several households bound together by bloodlines, marriage, and allegiance. These clans would work together to ensure that everyone had enough food, firewood, and protection. In a society where raiding, trading, and farming were the primary means of survival, clans provided a level of security and mutual benefit. The bonds of loyalty within a clan were powerful. Members knew that they could rely on each other in times of need, whether that meant sharing resources during the winter or coming together to defend their territory from threats. During the long winters, when external resources were scarce and the environment was a constant challenge, this sense of unity was vital. Viking society was not just about immediate survival but also about preparing for the future. The cold was not only an obstacle to living through the present, it was also a challenge that had to be planned for. Winter preparation was a communal endeavor. It began in the autumn, when the final harvests were gathered, meat was salted or smoked, fish were dried, and firewood was chopped. The community would come together to help each other stockpile food and fuel, ensuring that every household was prepared for the long months ahead. The act of preparing together created a sense of shared responsibility and solidarity. It was a reminder that no one could survive alone, and that strength came from collective effort. The Vikings' ability to plan for the winter months was a testament to their foresight and organizational skill, but it was also a reflection of their commitment to each other. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Viking society's social system in relation to survival was the concept of hygge, a term that, while not Viking in origin, embodies a similar spirit of communal warmth and comfort. In modern times, hygge refers to a cozy, intimate feeling of warmth, comfort, and belonging, often centered around the home and shared moments with loved ones. This concept is mirrored in the Viking social system, where shared meals, close quarters, and communal living were all part of creating warmth and connection. As the long, cold nights of winter stretched on, the Viking people found comfort not just in their physical environment, but in their relationships with each other. The longhouse became a sanctuary from the world outside, a place where the warmth of human connection could stave off the chill of isolation and despair. The role of the Viking chieftain, or jarl, was also crucial during these winter months. As the leader of the clan or tribe, the jarl was responsible for ensuring that resources were distributed fairly and that the clan's welfare was secured. While the everyday survival tasks were often handled by the family unit, the jarl's leadership helped maintain the broader social order. The chieftain would oversee the distribution of food, firewood, and other essentials, ensuring that no one was left wanting during the winter. This leadership extended beyond the physical resources of survival. It was also about providing moral and emotional guidance. The jarl would be the one to rally the community when times were tough, offering a sense of direction and purpose. His role as a unifying force helped maintain morale during the long, dark days of winter, when the cold could feel all-encompassing. In the Viking social system, winter was not a time for isolation, but a time for connection. The cold brought people together, strengthening the ties between families, clans, and tribes. It was a reminder that survival, in the harshest of conditions, was a collective effort. The cold may have been a formidable foe, but the strength of Viking unity was even greater. Through the bonds of family, community, and leadership, the Vikings were able to endure the worst of what winter had to offer, finding warmth in each other and in the shared commitment to survival. The social system of the Vikings was not just a structure of roles and responsibilities. It was a living, breathing force that allowed the people to face the cold with resilience, strength, and an unbreakable sense of unity. In the harsh, unforgiving climate of the Viking world, where winter could last for months and the cold could feel unrelenting, it wasn't just physical resources that ensured survival, it was the Viking mindset. The people of Scandinavia, whether they were seafarers, farmers, or warriors, possessed a unique resilience that allowed them to thrive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. This resilience was more than just a practical response to the cold. It was a deeply ingrained cultural trait that shaped every aspect of their lives. The Viking mindset, built on a foundation of stoicism, community, and an unshakable belief in their ability to overcome adversity, played a pivotal role in how they survived and thrived through the long, brutal winters. At the heart of the Viking mentality was a deep acceptance of the harsh realities of nature. The Vikings didn't try to deny or resist the cold. Instead, they accepted it as an inherent part of life. This acceptance did not mean resignation but rather a willingness to face the challenges of winter with determination and resourcefulness. The cold was something to be dealt with, not feared. There was no room in the Viking worldview for helplessness or despair. Instead, the Vikings embraced the harshness of their environment, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate their strength, endurance, and ingenuity. Their resilience wasn't just a personal trait, it was woven into the very fabric of their culture. A key element of Viking resilience was their deep connection to nature. The Vikings didn't see themselves as separate from the natural world, they were a part of it. They understood that survival depended on their ability to adapt to their environment, and that every challenge the cold presented was a chance to learn, grow, and become stronger. This mindset was reflected in their practical approach to survival. They didn't rely on luck or wishful thinking. They relied on their knowledge, skills, and the wisdom passed down through generations. They understood how to use every resource at their disposal, from animal pelts and wool to firewood and preserved food, to make their environment work for them. They learned to adapt to the seasons, to read the weather, and to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. The Vikings' resilience was also deeply tied to their sense of honor and pride. In Viking culture, survival was not just a matter of necessity, it was a matter of personal and collective honor. To survive the cold of the north was to prove one's strength, to endure not just for oneself but for one's family and community. The idea of honor was central to the Viking worldview. It was about facing adversity with courage and perseverance, no matter the odds. The cold was just one of many challenges that could test a Viking's resolve, and meeting that challenge head-on was seen as a mark of true character. Whether it was enduring the harsh winters, braving the open sea, or facing down an enemy in battle, the Vikings believed that overcoming adversity was the key to maintaining their honor and integrity. Another aspect of the Viking mindset was their emphasis on community and mutual support. In a world where the cold could kill just as easily as hunger, the Vikings knew that no one could survive alone. The idea of individualism was secondary to the importance of the group. Resilience was built on the strength of the collective, and it was in times of hardship that the Vikings' sense of community truly shone. During the long winter months, when resources were limited and isolation set in, the bonds between family and clan members were critical. The Vikings didn't just survive together, they thrived together. Their resilience was rooted in a shared sense of purpose, a recognition that each individual's survival depended on the strength of the group. The hearth, around which the family gathered, was not just a source of warmth, it was a symbol of the collective spirit that allowed them to weather the cold. The communal aspect of Viking life wasn't limited to immediate family and kin. The Viking tribe or clan also functioned as a unit of support and survival. In times of hardship, the community would come together to share resources, whether that meant firewood, food, or shelter. This sense of communal responsibility extended beyond immediate family lines. In Viking society, the welfare of the group was seen as paramount. Leaders, such as chieftains or jarls, were responsible not only for the safety and well-being of their people but also for ensuring that everyone was provided for during the harsh winter months. The role of the leader was to coordinate the collective efforts of the community, ensuring that resources were distributed fairly and that no one was left behind. This sense of shared responsibility fostered a deep sense of unity, which was essential for survival in the bitter cold. In addition to their reliance on community, the Vikings also drew strength from their connection to the past. The stories of their ancestors, the sagas of warriors, kings, and heroes who had faced great odds, provided a source of inspiration and strength. These stories were more than just entertainment, they were a vital part of Viking culture. They served as a reminder that adversity was not only a part of life but something that could be overcome through courage, strength, and determination. The tales of great battles, daring voyages, and enduring hardships were passed down through generations, serving as a cultural blueprint for how to face challenges. These stories reinforced the Viking belief that no matter how severe the winter, no matter how great the difficulty, they were part of a long tradition of resilience and survival. The Viking approach to winter survival was also deeply philosophical. While many cultures would retreat indoors, seeking to escape the cold, the Vikings embraced the winter as a time for growth and reflection. They understood that hardship was not a punishment but a test of their ability to endure, to adapt, and to emerge stronger on the other side. Winter was seen as a time of rest and reflection, a time to strengthen bonds with family and community, and a time to prepare for the challenges ahead. The long, dark nights of winter offered the Vikings an opportunity to reflect on their lives, to plan for the future, and to gather strength for the coming months. This period of introspection was not seen as a time of despair but as a time for personal and collective growth. This mental fortitude, the ability to face hardship with strength and resilience, was a key factor in the Vikings' ability to survive and thrive in their environment. While other cultures may have seen the long winters as a time of deprivation, the Vikings saw them as a challenge to be met head-on. The cold was a test of their resourcefulness, their unity, and their character. It was a time to prove their resilience, not just as individuals but as a people. They didn't view the winter as something to fear but as something to master. It was in the face of the cold, in the darkness of winter, that the true strength of Viking society was forged. The Viking mindset was one of adaptability, strength, and resilience, rooted in the belief that no challenge was insurmountable. They approached the cold with a combination of practical knowledge, communal support, and an unwavering determination to survive. This mindset allowed them to not only endure the harshest winters but to build a culture that thrived in the face of adversity. The Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they conquered it. And it was this resilience, this indomitable will to endure, that allowed them to continue their way of life, generation after generation, no matter what challenges the cold or the world might throw their way. In the cold, unyielding lands of Scandinavia, where winters stretched endlessly and survival demanded both resilience and resourcefulness, the Vikings found not just solace and strength in their practical strategies but also in their connection to the divine. Their belief system, rich with myth and spirituality, provided a framework for understanding and coping with the extreme challenges of their environment. The gods and spirits that the Vikings revered were not distant, abstract figures but powerful forces that were intimately connected to the world around them, shaping everything from the weather to personal fate. In the freezing cold, with nature at its most brutal, the Vikings turned to their gods not just for protection but for guidance, strength, and a deeper understanding of the world they lived in. Their spiritual beliefs infused their daily lives, helping them endure the long winters and harsh conditions with a sense of purpose and inner strength. The primary pantheon of gods that the Vikings worshipped was the Aesir, a group of deities who governed everything from war to harvest, from wisdom to death. These gods were not imagined as benevolent, all-knowing beings who intervened in every aspect of mortal life. Instead, they were seen as powerful, human-like figures who could be both helpful and destructive, and whose favor was not easily won. Among them, Thor, the god of thunder, was perhaps the most iconic, embodying strength, protection, and resilience. His hammer, Mjolnir, was not just a weapon but a symbol of power and protection against the forces of chaos. In a world where survival depended on strength, whether physical or mental, Thor became a patron for many Vikings facing the brutal realities of their existence. The cold of winter, with its relentless winds and icy grip, was often viewed as the chaos that threatened to unravel the Vikings' sense of security. Thor's role was to ensure that order prevailed, to keep the world of men safe from the forces of destruction. In Viking belief, the gods were not simply invoked during times of peace or victory. They were sought in times of hardship, when the cold seemed unbearable and the challenges of survival felt overwhelming. The Vikings believed that the gods were present in the natural world, embodied in the mountains, the rivers, the forests, and the storms. The physical world, with its harsh landscapes and capricious weather, was seen as a reflection of the divine order. The gods' presence was felt most strongly in times of adversity, when the forces of nature were at their most unforgiving. Winter, with its isolation, hunger, and danger, was a time when the gods were especially close, providing both a source of spiritual strength and a reminder of the Vikings' place in the world. In addition to Thor, the Vikings worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses who personified various aspects of life and death. Odin, the Allfather, was the chief of the gods and the god of war, wisdom, and death. He was a god who was not afraid of the cold, but who embraced it as part of the cycle of life and death. Odin sacrificed an eye in exchange for knowledge and hung himself from the world tree, Yggdrasil, to gain wisdom. This willingness to endure great suffering in pursuit of knowledge resonated deeply with the Viking worldview, where hardship was not something to be avoided but something that could be faced with honor and strength. Odin's wisdom was sought by Vikings who needed guidance during difficult times, especially in the long, dark winters when the world seemed to shrink in size and warmth. The connection between the Vikings and their gods wasn't limited to grand rituals or offerings. It was deeply woven into their daily lives, particularly through the practice of seidr, a form of Norse magic and divination. Seidr was often practiced by women, known as vulvas, who acted as seers and spiritual guides for the community. These women were believed to have the ability to communicate with the gods and the spirits of the dead, seeking their wisdom and guidance in times of uncertainty. The cold winter nights, with their isolation and darkness, were a time when these practices flourished, as the community turned inward for spiritual insight. The vulvas would enter trance-like states, seeking visions and messages from the gods. These rituals helped the Vikings not only endure the physical cold but also the mental and spiritual challenges of the winter months, offering them a deeper sense of purpose and connection to something greater than themselves. Rituals and sacrifices were an essential part of Viking spirituality, especially during the long winter months when the physical hardships of survival were at their most demanding. The Vikings believed that their gods required offerings in exchange for favor and protection, and these offerings were often made during specific times of the year. The Yule festival, which occurred during the winter solstice, was one of the most important spiritual events in the Viking calendar. It marked the return of the sun and the promise of a new cycle of life. During this time, the Vikings would offer sacrifices to the gods, particularly to ensure a good harvest in the coming year and to seek protection during the harsh winter months. The Yule celebrations would include feasts, sacrifices, and rituals designed to honor the gods and secure their favor. But it wasn't just the major festivals that marked the Vikings' connection to the divine. Everyday life was suffused with spiritual practices that helped them maintain a sense of purpose and unity during the long winters. Each meal, each journey, each decision was seen as a moment to honor the gods. Offerings were made to the household gods, known as landvetter, spirits believed to inhabit the land and protect the household. These spirits were invoked before setting out on journeys, starting work in the fields, or undertaking any significant task. The Vikings believed that the land itself was alive with the presence of these spirits, and by offering them respect and gratitude, they ensured their favor in return. The land spirits were also invoked during the colder months, when the danger of famine, illness, and death was at its highest. The land and the spirits that inhabited it were seen as vital allies in the fight against the cold. In the harsh winter months, when the nights seemed endless and the days were short, the Vikings would turn to their gods for comfort and guidance. The dark and cold were not seen as simply negative aspects of the world but as integral parts of the divine order. The Vikings understood that the cycle of life was marked by both light and darkness, warmth and cold, birth and death. This understanding gave them a unique sense of peace in the face of adversity. The cold winter nights, far from being a time of despair, were a time for reflection, spiritual renewal, and connection with the divine. They saw winter as a time of rest before the return of spring, a time for the gods to be honored and for their favor to be sought. It was a time to prepare mentally, emotionally, and spiritually for the coming months, drawing strength from the gods to survive the challenges ahead. Through their spiritual practices, the Vikings found not just a way to cope with the cold, but a way to transcend it. Their connection to the divine gave them the strength to endure hardships with grace and dignity, knowing that they were not alone in their struggles. The gods were seen as protectors, guides, and companions on the journey through life, and in the coldest and darkest months, this connection became even more crucial. The belief that the gods were watching over them, guiding them through the harsh winter and beyond, helped the Vikings face the brutality of the cold with a sense of purpose and confidence. In their devotion to the divine, the Vikings found the spiritual warmth they needed to endure the literal chill of the world. The Vikings are often celebrated for their seafaring prowess and fierce raids, but perhaps just as remarkable was their ability to survive and even thrive in the cold, unrelenting winters of Scandinavia. While their longships and weapons have become iconic symbols of their legacy, the Viking tools and technology that helped them combat the elements were just as essential to their survival. The harsh winters were not only a time of physical hardship but also a challenge that required the Vikings to innovate and adapt. With limited resources and technology compared to modern standards, the Vikings developed a remarkable array of tools and techniques that allowed them to manage the cold, gather food, and stay warm. Their ingenuity and practical know-how ensured that, even in the face of nature's most unforgiving season, they would continue to endure. At the core of Viking technology for surviving the cold were the tools they used to gather and prepare food. In a world where hunting, fishing, and farming were the primary means of subsistence, having the right tools was crucial. The Vikings' success in these areas can be attributed to their well-developed knowledge of their environment and their resourcefulness in using the materials available to them. For hunting, the Vikings employed an array of tools that were designed to withstand the cold and help them capture the animals they relied on for food. They used bows and arrows made from strong, flexible woods, ideal for long-range hunting even in frigid conditions. The arrowheads were often crafted from iron or bone, materials that could be easily fashioned and were durable enough to penetrate the thick hides of their prey. In addition to bows and arrows, the Vikings used spears, axes, and harpoons to hunt larger game and catch fish. These weapons were not just tools for battle but essential instruments of survival. Spears, for example, were designed for precision and could be used to hunt from a distance or close up, depending on the situation. The harpoons, with their sharp, barbed tips, were perfect for fishing in the icy waters of the fjords, lakes, and rivers. These tools allowed the Vikings to catch a variety of fish species, including salmon, cod, and herring, which were crucial for their winter food stores. The Vikings' fishing technology was sophisticated, and their ability to catch fish in the winter months helped ensure they had enough protein to survive when hunting was less viable. In addition to their hunting and fishing tools, the Vikings were skilled farmers who relied on tools to harvest crops and store food for the winter. Their most important farming tools included the plow, which was used to break the frozen ground during the short growing season, and the sickle, which allowed them to harvest grains and other crops efficiently. But the key to surviving the cold winter months lay not just in harvesting crops, but in preserving them. The Vikings had perfected methods of drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting food to ensure that it would last through the long, cold months when fresh food was scarce. They used drying racks to hang fish, meat, and fruits, and stored them in cool, dry places to prevent spoilage. They would also bury root vegetables, like carrots and turnips, in the earth or store them in cellars, where the cool temperatures of the ground helped preserve them. The ability to store food for long periods was essential for survival, and the tools used to prepare and preserve that food were critical to Viking success in the harsh winter months. One of the most important tools the Vikings had at their disposal for winter survival was fire. Fire provided warmth, light, and the ability to cook food, three of the most crucial needs in a world where the cold could kill as quickly as hunger. To create and maintain fire in the frozen wilderness, the Vikings used a combination of flint, steel, and tinder. This fire-starting method, which relied on striking flint against steel to create sparks, was effective even in wet and freezing conditions. Vikings carried fire-starting kits with them during their travels, ensuring that they could make fire wherever they went. Once fire was created, it was essential for keeping the longhouse warm. The hearth, central to Viking life, served as the focal point of the household, providing both heat and light. Maintaining the fire throughout the long winter was crucial, and the Vikings used tools such as fire pokers and tongs to manage the blaze and ensure it lasted as long as possible. The longhouse itself, the centerpiece of Viking shelter, was another technological marvel in terms of winter survival. The design of the longhouse, with its central hearth and thick walls made of timber and turf, was ideally suited to maintaining warmth during the cold months. The Vikings understood the importance of insulation, and they built their homes to trap heat inside while keeping the cold outside. They used animal hides, blankets, and furs to cover themselves during the night, ensuring that their bodies retained as much heat as possible. The raised sleeping platforms, positioned near the hearth, allowed people to sleep in relative warmth, close to the source of heat in the center of the house. As much as the longhouse provided shelter, it was the fire that allowed the Viking people to endure the coldest of winters. The fire was not only for warmth but also for cooking. The hearths would be used to cook stews, roast meats, and prepare preserved fish, providing the family with the nourishment they needed to survive the winter. These meals were hearty and filling, designed to provide the energy necessary to endure long days of hard work in the cold. The tools used in cooking, including cauldrons, pots, and spit-roasting implements, were built to withstand the harsh conditions of the cold and the demands of Viking life. The Vikings also demonstrated remarkable innovation in clothing, which was essential for surviving the cold. They made use of wool, animal hides, and fur to create clothing that would keep them warm in even the most brutal winter conditions. Wool, in particular, was highly prized for its insulating properties. Vikings wore woolen tunics, cloaks, and hats, which helped to trap warmth and wick moisture away from the body. The Vikings would often wear layers of clothing, with woolen garments worn close to the skin and fur cloaks and outer garments worn over the top to provide extra warmth. Boots made from leather and fur-lined hats were also common, ensuring that no part of the body was left exposed to the cold. In addition to these practical tools, the Vikings were also known for their use of technology in navigating the seas. The longship, one of the most iconic symbols of Viking technology, was an incredible feat of engineering, designed to withstand both the cold of the northern seas and the freezing winters on land. The longships were fast, durable, and capable of traveling long distances, even in rough weather. These ships were often used to raid, trade, and explore distant lands, and their design allowed the Vikings to travel across the frozen waters of the North Atlantic during the colder months when many other ships would have been stuck in harbor. The longships were designed to be lightweight, allowing them to be carried overland when necessary, and their flexible hulls could withstand the pressure of icy waters. For the Vikings, these ships were not just vessels of war or exploration, they were lifelines that connected them to the wider world, allowing them to trade goods, gather resources, and expand their reach. Viking technological innovation wasn't confined to the tools they used in daily life, it extended to their entire way of living. From their ships to their homes to their clothing, the Vikings developed technologies that were adapted to their environment, helping them survive and thrive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Their ability to design tools and technologies that addressed the physical challenges of their world was crucial in ensuring that they could endure the bitter cold of the long winters and the isolation that came with it. It was through their ingenuity, their ability to adapt, and their relentless pursuit of solutions to their problems that the Vikings were able to turn the coldest, most inhospitable environment into a world where they could not only survive but flourish. Their technological prowess was a key part of their enduring legacy, allowing them to endure the long winters and to leave a lasting mark on the history of the world. The cold and harsh winters of Scandinavia presented challenges that tested the Vikings' physical endurance, but it was their culture and shared traditions that helped them survive the psychological hardships of the long, dark months. In a world where the cold could stretch the body's limits, the mental resilience required to endure the isolation and despair that often came with the endless winter nights was just as vital. This mental fortitude was nurtured through storytelling, an essential part of Viking culture that helped to instill a sense of hope, connection, and purpose. The stories the Vikings told weren't just entertainment, they were a means of survival in the psychological sense, offering comfort, strength, and inspiration during the coldest, most challenging times. At the heart of Viking storytelling was the tradition of the skalds, poets, and bards who traveled between clans and families, sharing tales of gods, heroes, and epic journeys. These stories were woven into the very fabric of Viking society. They were passed down through generations, not only as a means of preserving history and culture but also as a source of emotional and spiritual support. The Vikings, deeply connected to their ancestors and gods, believed that these tales had power. The sagas and poems they shared were not mere recountings of past events. They were living, breathing narratives that carried the weight of Viking identity. Through the power of storytelling, the Vikings could endure the hardships of winter, feel connected to their past, and remind themselves of their place in the world. During the long, dark winter nights when the world outside seemed distant and inhospitable, the hearth became the center of Viking life. The warmth of the fire was not just physical, it was symbolic of the emotional and spiritual comfort that the community found when gathered together. It was around the hearth that families would listen to the skalds recount tales of heroism, adventure, and the triumph of the human spirit. These stories were much more than entertainment. They were a way to bond, to share values, and to pass down wisdom from one generation to the next. The collective experience of listening to these stories, particularly during the coldest times of year, created a sense of unity that transcended the isolation of winter. One of the most important aspects of Viking storytelling was its focus on resilience, courage, and honor in the face of adversity. The Vikings revered figures like Odin, Thor, and Freya not just as gods, but as embodiments of strength in times of hardship. These gods, while powerful and wise, were also deeply human in their struggles. Odin sacrificed an eye to gain wisdom, Thor fought the giants who embodied chaos and destruction, and Freya, the goddess of love and war, stood as a symbol of balance between opposites. Their stories were told not only to glorify their triumphs but to remind the Vikings that adversity was a part of life, and that strength came through enduring those trials with honor. For the Vikings, the cold and isolation of winter often mirrored the challenges that these heroes faced. The cold winter nights were a time of reflection, of gathering strength for the coming months. Listening to the sagas, the people of the Viking world found inspiration in the tales of gods and heroes who had faced seemingly insurmountable challenges. The stories were a form of mental preparation, teaching them that survival was about more than just physical endurance. It was about courage in the face of overwhelming odds, about maintaining hope even in the darkest times, and about coming together as a community to share that strength. Another critical element of Viking storytelling was its emphasis on fate and destiny. The Vikings believed in WRD, a concept that can be loosely translated as fate or destiny. The idea of WRD was central to their worldview and was reflected in many of their stories. They believed that their actions, while important, were part of a larger cosmic plan. The Norns, three female beings who controlled the fate of every person, were central to this understanding of life. The skalds often wove tales of how individuals and gods alike struggled against their destiny, yet ultimately fulfilled it, for better or worse. This belief in fate was especially powerful during the cold winters when the isolation and uncertainty could make people feel powerless. By connecting their individual lives to the larger story of the cosmos, the Vikings found a sense of comfort. The cold might have been unrelenting, but it was part of the greater cycle of life, a cycle that could not be avoided but must be faced with resolve and dignity. In addition to tales of gods and heroes, Viking stories also focused on the lives of ordinary men and women who faced hardship with bravery. These stories of everyday life were often less glamorous than those of gods and warriors, but they were no less significant. The everyday Viking, whether a farmer, a fisherman, or a blacksmith, was a central figure in the sagas. These individuals showed the same resilience and strength as the gods, and their stories provided a reminder that survival was not reserved for the powerful or the legendary. It was for everyone. These stories told of people who faced the cold and isolation, who endured the hardship of winter, and who triumphed through their own hard work and determination. For the Vikings, these everyday stories reinforced the values of perseverance, honor, and community that were essential to their way of life. Storytelling also served as a way to keep the memory of ancestors alive. The Vikings placed great importance on remembering those who came before them. The dead were honored, and their deeds celebrated. This was particularly important during the winter, when the days were shortest and the nights longest. The cold winter nights, which could easily feel endless and oppressive, were the perfect time to recount the stories of ancestors who had faced similar hardships. These ancestral stories provided a sense of continuity, a connection to those who had gone before, and a reminder that the struggles of life were not new. The same challenges had been faced by those who had lived through the winters before them, and if they could survive, so could the Vikings of today. As the skalds wove these tales around the hearth, they also spoke of the values that bound the Viking people together: loyalty, courage, and the importance of kinship. In a world where the cold could make survival uncertain, it was these values that ensured the unity of the community. The stories told around the fire reminded everyone that they were not alone. They were part of something larger, something greater than the harsh winter. By listening to the tales of past warriors, past heroes, and even past farmers, the Vikings reinforced their connection to each other. They reminded themselves of their shared purpose, their shared struggles, and their shared strength. The role of storytelling in Viking culture wasn't just about survival during the winter months. It was a means of cultural cohesion that bound the community together year-round. But in winter, when the cold could seem endless, storytelling became especially important. It was a way to stay connected to the divine, to honor the past, to strengthen the community, and to remind each other that survival was possible even in the harshest of conditions. By sharing these stories, the Vikings not only kept their culture alive but also forged the mental resilience they needed to face the challenges of the cold and the dark. In their stories, they found the strength to endure, to rise above the adversity, and to believe that even the coldest winter would eventually give way to the warmth of spring. Thus, storytelling became an essential tool for the Vikings in their struggle against the cold, not just in the practical sense but in the emotional and psychological sense as well. The sagas didn't just entertain, they helped to shape the Viking mindset, providing a blueprint for how to live with honor, strength, and community in the face of life's hardest trials. Through their stories, the Vikings found the will to survive the cold, both physically and mentally, and passed that resilience on to generations that would follow. The Vikings are often remembered as fierce warriors, expert navigators, and skilled traders, but their legacy extends far beyond these well-known aspects of their culture. One of the most significant, though often overlooked, elements of Viking life was their ability to innovate and adapt to some of the harshest environmental conditions known to humanity. Living in Scandinavia's unforgiving cold, the Vikings didn't just survive, they thrived, creating a way of life that allowed them to endure the long, dark winters and venture forth into the world beyond. Their technological advancements, social structures, and cultural practices laid the foundation for survival in one of the most challenging climates in the world. But what made the Vikings truly remarkable wasn't just their ability to endure the cold, it was their ability to innovate, build, and leave a lasting impact on the world. Viking innovation began with their ability to adapt to their environment. The cold winters of Scandinavia were harsh, often lasting for months with minimal daylight. During this time, survival required not only physical endurance but an understanding of how to use the environment to one's advantage. One of the key innovations that helped the Vikings survive was their mastery of the longhouse, the traditional dwelling that became central to Viking life. The longhouse was designed not only for functionality but also for warmth, comfort, and community. Constructed from timber, stone, or turf, longhouses were insulated against the cold with thick walls and thatched roofs. The central hearth provided warmth and light, and its placement at the heart of the home created a communal space where families could gather to share meals, tell stories, and bond during the long winter months. The longhouse was more than just a shelter from the cold, it was a microcosm of Viking society. It was a place where social bonds were formed and strengthened, where traditions were passed down, and where the community came together to share in both hardship and joy. The communal nature of Viking homes was an essential aspect of their survival strategy. By sharing a space and resources, Vikings were able to pool their strength and resilience. The longhouse, as much as it was a technological marvel, also reflected the Vikings' understanding of the importance of unity. In a world where the cold could threaten to isolate individuals, the Vikings recognized the power of coming together as a community to face challenges. The Vikings were not only innovative in their home design but also in their use of natural resources. Living in a land rich with forests, rivers, and mountains, the Vikings learned to use the materials at hand to build everything from tools and weapons to boats and clothing. Their mastery of metallurgy, for example, allowed them to craft strong, durable weapons and tools, which were essential for both survival and warfare. Viking swords, axes, and spears were known for their quality and craftsmanship, combining durability with precision. These weapons, which helped the Vikings defend themselves against the harsh natural world as well as rival tribes, became symbols of their strength and ingenuity.